Hi, I'm Angela Breidenbach, and I'm your genealogy publishing coach. And I'm excited to bring to you today a friend of mine, Cynthia L. Simmons. And she has a new book series out that is set during the Civil War. And in addition to that, she has the third book in the series has just released. So I'm excited to talk to her about that. But I'm excited to share her with you also because listeners of Genealogy Publishing Coach, I think the reason you're listening is not just to discover new books, but to discover how you can write your own genealogy, ancestral, family history stories, memoirs, all those different things that help us share and preserve our life stories and our ancestors' life stories with the world. So, welcome to Genealogy Publishing Coach and welcome Cynthia L. Simmons.
Thank you for having me. It's always a delight to be with Angela.
Oh, I'm excited to have you. And because you're very knowledgeable in this arena. And one of the most important things that we're trying to do here is not just help new writers, but help authors who are both self publishing and traditional publishing learn how to do it professionally, whether it's traditional or indie. And indie is just another word for self publishing, you know that, but maybe some
Mhm.
of our listeners don't. And it's really important too that our job as writers, as sharers of the stories, is to do it in a way that's not just professional, but also commercially readable. There's a lot of people that they want to do their stories and they just want to do it for their family. That's very legitimate. But there's always in the back of the mind that idea of, oh, I want everybody to read this book. But what are some of the, let's say, stumbling stones that maybe you've experienced as an author trying to figure out how to get people to read your book?
Well, you're right. Not everybody wants to read your book. And I think one of the most important things for a writer is to figure out who they're writing to. And I think I've picked them out. I was in the airport the other day coming home from St. Louis, and I saw the lady sitting there, and I thought, that's one of my readers. And I went over and spoke to her and just asked her what she was reading. And sure enough, she was one of my readers. And she was delighted that I was writing historical fiction and that I was writing historical fiction that was clean because she can't handle the stuff that's coming out these days. So it's important to know who you're writing to. And you might get some peripheral interest because my books are on the money of the Civil War. You might get some peripheral interest if the wife buys a book and the husband discovers it's something he's interested in. Because I've had some men go, "Oh, banking, that is interesting." And so the men might read it, but it's going to probably be the women that buy it.
Well, and I think sometimes, especially with the topics that you're discovering and uncovering and reminding people of, they do get forgotten to history. And
Yes.
people don't. I remember when your first book in this series came out, and it just stunned me that so much stuff had happened in the banking world during the
Mhm.
Civil War. Why don't you start and tell us a little bit about that, and then draw us a little bit into the next book, and then tell us more about your third book?
Well, we can go back to the Revolutionary War to kind of get started because when they established the Constitution and so on, they decided because of the Revolutionary War and because they had so much inflation, they decided to put in the Constitution that you could only use gold and silver for exchange. And then, of course, later on, they passed a law, 1793, the Coinage Law, which included some copper for the pennies. But from then on, it was pretty much coin unless there was a precious metal shortage somewhere. And that did happen at times. And sometimes banks would put out paper from their bank that supposedly you could go in and exchange for gold if you needed to. The problem was banks were always going out of business. And if you ended up with paper from them, then they went out of business. The paper was worthless. So they were called broken banknotes. So that's kind of how things happened until about the time of the Civil War. Whenever you get into a war, you always have inflation because you've got more demand and more need and all that. And so you really do need to have a really strong economy for a war. Well, the South had no way to finance. I mean, they didn't want to tax their people. They were already, states' rights was their big thing. So they decided to use loans to do it. And they used loans and paper, but the paper didn't have anything behind it. It was just, look, we're going to put this out and it's going to earn interest at a certain point in time if you'll hang on to it. Well, did they hang on to it? That's the problem, because pretty soon inflation began to happen and they began exchanging those pieces of paper. And a lot of times when those paper came back, if they did exchange it for anything, they exchanged it for more banknotes that were not worth anything because they hadn't even, given the interest on the other ones. So
Oh,
the
wow.
problem is that in the Civil War, not only did the government do it, the Confederate government, but all of the banks, all the cities, everybody was putting out their own currency because they had to have something to spend, and they were figuring out, how much money do I have based on, I'm going to get this much interest or that much interest. And so they all started putting out paper money. So there was a massive amount of paper money, and nobody knew what was good and what was not good because there was a lot of counterfeiting. So that's kind of where we get into the story, is that begins to be a problem as the Confederacy comes along and says, well, we're just going to use, loans. And so, give us your gold and we'll give you some paper. And that's where it starts. And then this bank that tries to stay alive says, I am going to get more gold while I'm trying to do business, so that whatever happens, I end up with gold and I don't have to deal with this currency. In the last book that came out, Reflecting Gold, what happened was,
Hold that up a little higher so we can see that beautiful cover.
there it is. A man in the military came to the bank and said, I want to buy a house and I want to pay it back in Confederate money. And he was horrified that they wouldn't let him. So he said, I'm going to start talking about you. You must be a traitor to the country if you won't use the Confederate bills. And so it kind of created a situation where they said, okay, we can change our policies just for you. And they rewrote it so that an officer with a certain amount of good credit and so on would be able to do it in this situation. And even then they could have refused him. But because they changed their policies, then the guys that owned the bank said, well, I'm going to start pulling my money out. So it created a lot of problems because they were trying to help this particular man. And then when the particular man turns up dead, then there's a lot of accusations flying around. So it's a mystery about who's trying to get a hold of the bank. And it just keeps going. It's a page turner.
Wow. And you found a lot of this in real history, didn't you?
Yes, I did. I did a lot of research about money and history. And yes, and I've got lots of dollars to back it up because I went out and on the internet and started looking for money. And there's a store in the area and nearby where I can go and purchase some of that old money and show it and stuff. And so I've really gotten into paper money from the past. It's a lot of fun when I go show it.
And it has no value today,
It
right?
has no value except to collectors. And, depending on what it is, the collectors may pay you a lot for something. And another thing they did, they also had pieces of paper for coins, like 10 cents, 5 cents, 25 cents. And it was called fractional currency, which I think is so fascinating. And nobody's ever heard of that. But in the North, there became a coin shortage. And so they had to do it in the North as well. So it's very interesting.
Fascinating, because I know doing my research as a professional genealogist, and I have my certification in English records and things, and I had to go into the research of coinage and money that came out of the origins of England and Great Britain, all the UK. And I think one of the things that surprised me the most as a student back then was that coins were minted in a way that you could break them and
Yes.
you could make a fraction out of it. And so
Mhm.
that just really stunned me. And so you could end up having like a little tiny triangle of a
Mhm.
coin, and that would be your eighth, of a
1 bit, 2 bit, 3 bit, 4. That came right out of the Revolutionary War when they took the Spanish dollar and cut it into 8 pieces.
wow. And so I think that's amazing. But they did that all the way back before the Middle Ages.
Mhm.
So I thought it is fascinating what we learn about money and money systems when we're studying history and genealogy. I mean,
It's very interesting. And, they were always, sometimes they would take the gold and just shave a little piece off of it too, because, the gold and silver was the value, because people wanted the metal. And so the coinage itself was the thing that had value. That's why they would shave things off of it or cut it up like you suggested.
well, and I think it's interesting too that you found that nugget, ha, pun
Yeah.
intended. And then you took that and you created a story out of it. Were any of the people in your stories real?
Yes, I did. I based it out of my hometown in Chattanooga, and there were certain key people that I put in there on purpose so that there would be a background of real life.
So, for those who are watching and listening, they could contact you and maybe find out what other research you have for their ancestors.
Yes, I have. I'm in DAR and I have done ancestor research. Love it.
Hmm. And so,
Love
some
it.
of these people, though, that are in your books, they was there anything that really surprised you about them? What made you put them in your books versus somebody else?
Well, the particular family, the Macaulay family, was kind of a pivotal family in Chattanooga history. And there's a road named after him. And, every place you turn, there's Macaulay that in Chattanooga. So he was kind of a big person. And he was a pastor too, a godly man. And I actually got to read some of his handwriting. I found a member of the family that had some of his letters and stuff, which was a lot of fun. I always
Oh,
love to read original handwriting. Nothing as exciting as there to see their handwriting.
this is
And
my one pet peeve now is that they've taken handwriting out of biblical.
I disagree. I think that's very wrong. I think people's
Oh,
handwriting is very characteristic. It tells you a lot about the person.
and it's disastrous because our children who are growing up today can't read original documents
That's
or
right. They can't read handwriting if they don't do it themselves.
and
That's right.
how do you tell a story if you can't read the person's true
That's right.
words,
Yeah.
right? And that
Well, there were some differences, I guess. Like if there were two S's, that would make an F and an S. So there were some differences in the handwriting back then. But usually I could decipher it if I sit with it long enough, and I love doing it.
well, and you can do paleography. You can take, classes like that,
Hmm.
especially through the National Institute of Genealogical Studies. You can take some great classes to help you learn how to read and decipher, and they'll take you all the way back into some of the early handwriting and things. So it's really nice to be.
Hmm.
But the kids today, they can't even read the Constitution. You
Mm-mm.
they can't read any of these things. And I was thinking about it. My grandmother was Swedish, and she did her Bible studies, and
Hmm.
sometimes she would slip and write words in Swedish, but she would do postcards back and forth between her sisters and her cousins and her moms and her mom and her aunts and people like that. And so my cousin called me a couple of weeks ago, and she said, I have a postcard. Or she had a book that was people used to collect autographs and things like
Hmm.
that. And I said, well, what is it? And she says, well, it's from 1925 and it was grandma's. And in Swedish, that's mormor, which is mother's mother, right? So if it's your father's mother, it's farmor. So this is my mother's mother, so it's mormor. And she had, it was from 1925, 1926, where all of these well wishes and autographs and things, but they were in Swedish. And I said, well, hold on. I know a little Swedish and I know how to get the Google Swedish thing. So we started going back and forth. I said, okay, spell that to me. And if I knew the word, I'd tell her. If not, I'd look it up on, Google
Hmm.
Translate. And we deciphered quite a few of the messages in there. And she says, this sounds like she's graduating from something, but she was born in 1904. I said, oh, yeah. She graduated from junior high and high school. And that was her junior high graduation. And it was in 1925. And she's like, well, why did she graduate so late? Well, because when she was 16 years old, she was told there's too many mouths to feed. You have to go make your way in the world.
Mm.
And that purple picture right there was her total inheritance. And it's
Wow.
a Swedish hand blown purple picture. And that was her inheritance. That was given to her. And so she worked and worked and worked. And then she went to finish junior high, graduated eighth grade. And then she went to high school and she finished that in a very short time and she graduated. So all these people, she would take the train and go back and forth between where she was working at in St. Paul, Minnesota, I think it was, back to Fox Home in Fergus Falls area, a couple hours train ride, right? And then they celebrated that she had done that all on her own. and then she became a nurse. And I'm like, this is a story that needs to be told, right?
That's a story that needs to be told.
But if I didn't know how to understand the letters, and my cousin, who's slightly older than me, didn't know how to understand the letters because they're in handwriting, didn't understand how to look up the English to Swedish. I even have a dictionary. Where would we be? We wouldn't even know. We
Hmm.
wouldn't have deciphered that that was the celebration of her junior high graduation at 21
That's a
years,
big thing.
you know. And back then, now that's that, you get into the sensibilities of,
Hmm.
you know, and it's like, well, why are they graduating at 21 years old from eighth grade? You know, such different sensibilities.
It's a different way of thinking.
Yeah. So that's, I was fascinated with what you were talking about. Sorry, I had to share my own story.
Well, I found a really neat story amongst my parents' things when I was going through it after my father died. I had an aunt who died when she was 15, and I found some paper amongst her things and a hospital bill. And I finally figured out that what they did was she had gotten pneumonia and been admitted to the hospital, and they were counting the days on the envelope to make sure they were charged the right amount, which I think that the total bill was like $13. But they were
Wow.
trying to make sure that they had been charged the right amount by making, looking at the dates and writing down all that stuff on the back of the envelope. And I thought, man,
Wow.
the pain they must have felt. First, their daughter dies at 15, and then they're, concerned about money. It's a sad story.
Oh my goodness. And then, but to preserve that sense of life and
Yes.
and tragedy, I think that's important.
Yeah.
And I think some of the things that get lost in, translation from history to
Mhm.
contemporary is exactly that, how difficult it was. And then we get this idea in our head that, well, they're just people like us. Well, yeah, but there was a there was a different way of doing society. There was a different
Mhm.
way of doing life. And so we can't look at them through exactly the same eyes as we have today because we're colored by what our societal preferences are,
Right.
you know. And I think so. It's fascinating to me that even a bank would make an exception for one person or make a rule so that one person, would qualify. So what set you on to this story in the first place?
Well, I felt like it was, first of all, fun to tell how money had changed, and then the difficulties that you would have in dealing with people. Because, if you took one of the paper that you had, say that you got it from the city of Chattanooga, and went to a merchant and tried to buy something, they could refuse the paper because they couldn't be sure that it was any good. And so they might bargain with you and say, well, that says $1, but I'll say it's 50 cents and accept it. Or they could say, well, the price of the item is higher. So we have no concept of that because we're so used to the bills that say this is legal tender for all debts, public and private. That really meant something because most things, there wasn't legal tender during the war, except in the North in 1862 when they did pass a legal tender law. But in the South, there wasn't any such thing. And the bills that they put out, they didn't want you to pay taxes with that because that was worthless. They wanted your gold. So the fact that they're calling it legal tender is a big thing. And I thought that was important for us to remember. So that's where the stories came from.
That is fascinating. I'm going to add to that one thing that would give you a sense of contemporary, modern, equivalent maybe, and that is when we were in Scotland about 3 years ago now. Um, we were exchanging our, you use your debit card. In fact, that was the strangest thing to me is that nobody ever really went into the bank. They always went to the machine outside the bank.
Right.
I didn't know that I thought it was kind of a little strange. But when we were there, if you got the money, it was being distributed in, if you went to one bank, in Scottish pounds, and if you went to another bank, sterling pound, and it made a difference because there were very few stores in England proper versus Scotland proper because they're both part of the
Hmm.
UK, Great Britain, but England proper, not all the stores, in fact, very few
Would
stores,
take it. Hmm.
Scottish money. And I found that really interesting. Or like you said, the price was higher. You know?
Mhm.
And I thought, wow. So we got warned by folks, make sure that you either get rid of and spend all of your Scottish money, or get it in sterling pound, because it won't be any good once you cross
Right.
the border. And so I can imagine being people in the Civil War era having that same type of a situation, only because I experienced that.
Mhm.
And I think if you
And I
can,
used some money in England one time. They told me that it had expired, and
what?
it was British sterling. And I handed it to the lady at the cashier. She said, "Oh, this bill is expired. You're going to take it to the bank." And I went, "What? Because money here doesn't expire." I took it to the bank, and they exchanged it, gave me a new one, and then that was acceptable. But they don't do as well keeping counterfeiters, under control. So their money expires at a certain point.
And I think it's really important to understand that there are different laws and
Yes.
common ways of doing things when you're researching, your stories as well, because that societal exchange, putting that into your book, is really important to bringing your
Mhm.
characters to life, isn't it?
Yes.
How did you do some of your research so that people who are trying to bring their characters and their stories to life, how would you tell them to start?
Well, I wanted my characters to be real. So some of them I actually kind of modeled after people that I know so that it would have a feel to real life.
Yeah. One of the things too that I think is important is to look at like newspapers and journals of the time, so that you get the right lingo. Because
Yes, I did try to drop in. Obviously, if I talked totally like they did in the Civil War, people would have been bored to tears. But I tried to find key words that I would use periodically to make it sound older, because we would be bored to tears probably if we listened to their conversations, since they would be more formal.
yeah, it's a little bit different in language, and words have completely different meanings also.
Yes, they do.
And I think that's a really important thing to think about when you're writing your stories. Now, do you have an editor? How do you do your editing process?
I do usually use an editor. I will finish the book and edit it myself some. And particularly, one thing I've learned to do is to have it read out loud on Word. And because a lot of times you'll pick up things that don't sound right or awkward if I listen to it. And then I
Wait,
will
stop
send it.
there for a second before you do that. For people who are not techie, how do you listen to your words read out loud in a Word doc?
There's an icon up in the corner that you can click on in Word, and it will read out loud. It's in the upper right left hand corner. And it's a little A. And that A, if you hit on that, you can drop down and it will have text to speech and it will read to you. Now,
Oh,
it's not going to sound really great. It's not going to have a lot of vocal variety, but it will let you listen to the words so that if there's a mistake or if you spell something wrong or whatever, you can catch a lot of things that don't sound right.
I love that. And do you use any tools like Pro Writing Aid or Grammarly or anything like
I
that?
have used Grammarly, and sometimes Grammarly helps, and sometimes it just annoys me.
Okay. How does it? I just have to ask because people are always asking me for, editing tools. I use Pro Writing Aid. Um, but I want to know, what is it about Grammarly that you like and that you don't like?
Well, sometimes it wants me to take out some of the prepositions that I use, and sometimes I use those prepositions in order to sound older.
Mhm.
So that kind of annoys me. But I'm trying to think what are the things I didn't like, because now I've kind of forgotten. I haven't used it recently,
Mhm.
but it did help me find things that didn't work, that were maybe a little awkward, and that was
Yeah.
useful.
I found accidentally, my most recent character's name is Hugh, Huge, and I
Mhm.
found twice that I had typed huge,
Oh,
Huge. I was like, oh. And so now I'm going to go back through in Word and I'm going to do a search and replace and
mhm,
verify that I didn't accidentally type an E instead of an H. So
mhm.
some of those dumb things that happen that are really kind of humorous in the process.
Yeah.
I
And
also
I have certain words that I love that I have to watch out for that I tend to use over and over because that's the only word that will say what I've got to say. So I have to make sure I don't overdo them.
Yes, 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 yes. Or if there's a particular phrase a character uses regularly.
Mhm.
Um, and I found I really like Pro Writing Aid, but I've found that I have to verify everything that's telling me because same thing. Even though I've clicked historical fiction on the settings, it often misses something that I'm trying to do that's more historically accurate because Pro Writing Aid, Grammarly, these are tools, but they're not a human editor, one.
Right.
And two, they're not historians. They're just trying to get you closer to what they think the cadence or closer to the spelling of the time might be. But I've found that in any tool, whether it's Word or Pro Writing Aid, that I often have to add to dictionary,
Hmm.
or if I have a character, I have a little boy who doesn't speak proper English. So of course every single thing he says is going to have,
It's going to be caught. Yeah.
yeah. And so I'm constantly having to ignore or not do the rule, break the rule for this or that. But
Hmm.
it still makes me look at the sentence more specifically.
Hmm.
I think that's really important. Okay, you were going to go on past there. I asked you about your tools. Go ahead.
So you want me to talk more about money?
No, I meant the tools that you use to actually write your stories.
Oh, well, in terms of research, I usually try to get as many diaries as I can and the history of the area. So I did a lot of research in my hometown so that I knew that, kind of what the streets layout were and how they originally named them and so on. And then I create my characters. Like I say, I used some main characters that were in the city that were kind of major characters. And then I created my characters outside of that would maybe interact with them in different ways because I knew what the characters that really lived did. So I had them interact.
I like that because it gives you a sense of being able to do story. And I
Hmm.
got asked, well, how do you know what so and so said? And I said, well, that's kind of where you're like, put yourself in a situation that's similar. If you're having a marital argument, what kind of personality is that person? You find out from their journal, and you find out, are they the kind of person who's going to dig in their heels? Are they
Hmm.
the kind of person who's going to give in to everything? You know, and then it's pretty easy to figure out what they probably said.
Right,
To give
right.
you the essence of the feel of their place and time and personhood.
Hmm.
So it's
Yeah.
unless you have a direct quote, sometimes you have to create a fictional conversation that's based in reality. Is how I kind of like to explain
Yes.
it. Yeah. So, okay, now that you decided you were going to do this series, it's done with 3 books?
Yes. It's time with 3 books.
And did you mention that you're starting a new one?
Yes, I am starting a new one. I'm actually researching the area that I live right now for a story in 1870 that'll be after the Civil War. So, having a great time learning about the area that I live in. And it's easy because I can just go to the library and visit the churches of the area and get to know people and find about their relatives. So, I've had a good time.
How do you visit the churches of the area? Because I know you go to church at a particular church and you can go in and talk to your church secretary, your pastor, church historian, but how do you visit with other churches of the area and what have you learned from that?
Well, actually, there were 2 churches that were pretty much there when the city got started, and I knew about them. And so I simply emailed somebody at the church and said, "Here's what I'm interested in doing. Would you let me come and see your history? Because I know you were there pretty much when the city started." And they let me. They were very excited about it. They had me come to their library. I met one of the men that loves their history, and he told me all kinds of fun stories. We had a great time. I spent a whole afternoon there chatting
Ooh.
with them. And then he gave me a couple of interesting manuscripts as well as a book about the church's history. So it was great. Now, the other church I'm still waiting to get into because they're closed because of COVID, but they also have a history, and I'm looking forward to getting to know that. And there's some other places. There's a couple of library places that I can go and stuff. But yeah, I love to get if I can get original documents, that's absolutely great because I know that I'm getting down to what actually happened.
Oh, I think that's fabulous. So you're being a detective in history.
Oh, I love being a detective.
I know, it's so much fun. I'm going to give a tip based on what you just said, though. when you do visit with a church, it's really important for our viewers and our listeners out there to make sure you know what their expectations are. So, some of these documents could be hundreds of years old.
Mhm.
So you want to ask them, do you want me to wear gloves? How do you want me to protect these things? Because the person who is maybe there might be a volunteer, they might be a church member just letting you in, and they may not know all of the ways to protect old, antique, or ancient documents and things. So, as a person who's researching whether it's your ancestors' history, your hometown, your new town, whether you're writing a story or an article in a magazine, or you're just blogging about it for travel, whatever you're doing, you need to make sure that you protect those documents and manuscripts and things like that by asking the right questions and not leaving oily fingerprints. And I don't mean oily because you've been in a bag of potato chips.
Right.
Never, never,
But
never.
your fingers have oil on them.
Fingers have oil on them. And yeah, and don't use things like pens. Only take in pencils, and if possible, ask them their permission to take photographs of the documents, because a photograph of a document is the equivalent
The document.
of the document. But you then have to, you don't get to just say this is that document. You have to then tell where you got that.
Mhm.
Your citations are important too.
Yes.
So now, do you share any of those documents either in the book somehow, family trees, or on your blog or website somehow? How do you help readers know the veracity of your research?
That is a really good question, and that's something I have not done yet. But I did keep the material from these first three books, so that if anybody asked me my sources, I could give them sources. But the stuff that I'm getting, for instance, there's one person again in my city that was very, very influential, and his whole family was. And one of the sons that is a contemporary, still lives here, has written a very detailed history of his family, a book about this thick, which I have, and he gave me permission to use anything in there. So that's great. And I keep reading it, finding more stories. So it's given me a really good sense for the area. Plus, as you go along, you start seeing, oh, that name is showing up again, and that name is showing up again. So it kind of helps you get a feel for what the city was like. It's lots of fun.
What do you think is the reason that you started into this whole thing in the first place? First book you ever wrote for history like this. Why?
One of the things I want to do is to illustrate how history reflects the truth of scripture. And there's if you obey the scripture, you have a long-term situation, a marriage. My husband and I've been married now 43 years, and we've had a very good marriage, but it's because we have based it on the principles of scripture, and we get along reason not that we're perfect, but that we get along well and we love each other. But you put yourself in a situation where you're not obeying scripture and you're living selfishly, things don't work. And so in the long run, if you obey scripture, it works really well. And I love those Psalms that say, the memory of the righteous is blessed, but the memory of the wicked man is cursed. The history will show that when you do it the right way, it's a whole lot better. And that's why I think it's really good to get into history, because it does illustrate scriptural truth so strongly. Someone that was really beloved, you can tell why they were beloved because of the things that they did. Whereas someone that nobody likes, you can find out why, and some of the consequences of those behaviors. So that's one reason I love to do it, is because it's such a good illustration of scripture.
That's a really great answer. Now, you recently joined the DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution.
Yes.
And what chapter are you in?
I'm in Fielding Lewis in Georgia.
Fielding Lewis, is that what you said?
Mhm.
Okay. And you told me just before we started, I thought this was interesting, that you were able to join because of which ancestor?
There was a man on my grandmother's side who was a juror, um, and he was a patriot. Now, I didn't get in on the one that I wanted to, because there was a couple of things that they didn't feel like was totally proved, even though we thought they were totally proved. But they took my application and used an application that was already in there, and kind of pasted me in because they had proved that relative. So I don't know as much about him as I would like to do, but I know that his son also fought. So I immediately turned around once I found that they proved my relative, and then I asked for them to do his son, so as a supplemental. So I know I have 4 relatives that were definitely involved in the war. One of them was a juror, but the rest of them fought, and I think I probably have a couple more.
Yeah, I'm not surprised, and I'm finding them coming out of the woodworks of all
Yes,
different,
yes,
you know. But I think it's really important that people understand that when you join an organization like the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, um, that it is more possible and probable to be able to join the organization through someone that is already there. And
yes,
you usually have to go back about 3 generations, maybe 4, to tie into a lineage that's already there.
yes,
But then, like you said, you can create a supplemental off of that for people that maybe haven't been approved or declared as having been known to be a
yes.
revolutionary soldier. And I think it's really important that people realize that when you do go to join a chapter in your area, you don't have to join the chapter of the city that your person was from or the
No,
county, the state. You can join your local chapter, and they have people there to help you find out, so you can go before you're a member, and
yes,
they have people that will help you with your application and your ancestral research. But
they
what
sure do. And they work very hard.
they do, and what's fascinating, like you said to me before we started the show, you don't know much about this person that you actually were able to join through their
Hmm.
lineage and their name. You have to be a direct ancestor,
Hmm.
direct to that ancestor. But now is the fun part of researching who that
Yes,
person is.
that's what I'm looking forward to doing.
Yeah, and then maybe because you're already a writer, telling their story. I,
Yes.
yeah, there are some classes that you can take uh, as a student of genealogy through like National Institute of Genealogical Studies. They have a family historian, how to write your family history, those kinds of things, which are really nice. But I love being able to talk to someone who's already a professional author and get some of the tidbits and secrets that you shared with us today. If you had anything to tell somebody who wanted to share a family history story of one of their ancestors, maybe even one of their parents, um, what would you tell them to do in starting their manuscript?
Get as much information as you can so that you get a feel for that individual, because all of them have their own personalities. And I even visit their graves. I mean, once I learn about them, I want to see where they're buried, because sometimes there's even things on the tombstone that will help you learn about them. So,
That is so true. We put on my dad's tombstone, he used to read to us that little story of the train. I'm sure many,
mhm.
millions of people know the story of I think I can, I think I can, I think I
Yes.
can, right? Well, my dad was one of those kind of people who's like, well, I think I can, and I will, and I did,
Hmm.
you know. So we
Yeah.
put on his gravestone, I thought I could, uh, and I know I did. You know,
Mhm.
it's like I think it's really important to definitely show their personality somehow, give an essence of that human being, and
Yes.
preserving their story. And sometimes you're right; it's in a
Yes.
line that's on a gravestone. Oh, thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you for being with us here today,
Oh,
Cynthia.
I've had a great time. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm going to share a couple little tips for our viewers real quick. Um, this is a 7 generation family tree, and you can see it's all folded up and everything. And that's because this goes with me whenever I travel to do research. It's my overview. These are the people I have proven. I don't have to have every single thing on there about their proof. I've got a folder at home with it. But this gives me, whenever you walk into a family history library or a family history center or a special genealogy society or any place, a church, anything, it's really hard to always remember this person to this person to this person to this person. And
Oh,
then,
it is, especially if they have similar names. And they did that. They would name them after people. So you
oh,
end up with a lot of James or a lot of similar things.
and to know what they're, and sometimes if for instance my ancestor John Milligan had a brother named Thomas, well then his daughter married a guy whose father's name was Thomas, and you start
Mhm.
having this name start to go through the family.
Yep.
So you're right, finding out who belongs to who. So I take at least this one, a 7 generation one, I just fold it up and it goes with me everywhere when I'm doing my research. And you can get these. There's this one was from a publisher, the Everton Publishers in Logan, Utah. But you can get free ones or $5 ones for. I've got one that's like a 9 generation. Sorry, I'm folding it up. Huh, see, huh, fits in the suitcase. But it was making crinkle noise. But you can get that, and if you go to the Family History Library in their first level when you walk in Salt Lake City, you can get the big fan charts, and those are beautiful. And there's you can get a free one from them for whatever's on there. I don't ever take anything that's on Family Search for gospel because people can just add and subtract or
Yes.
whatever. It's really important to realize that. But if you get the free one that's offered to you, I think it goes back 7 or 9 or 10 generations, whatever it is, of the fan. It's a beautiful opportunity to see what people think is there, and then you can prove or disprove, like your way of being a detective.
Hmm.
Um, but it also gives you a really big overview to carry with you. And then, if you want to, you can take color coding to it or something to help you follow a particular name line. And you can cross out if you've proven or if you've disproven someone. So I think those are some really good ways to keep track of it as you travel to do your research. And I think you could do that for your stories too, for the
Yes.
families that you're doing. So I think that's really important. A couple of tips that I wanted to share with people for sticking with us today through the Genealogy Publishing Coach show. And then I think it's important too to be aware that you need to cite all of your information and keep your sources like you did. I think that's crucial. So I'm really glad to have had you with us. And I'm just going to share real quick that I have got my second book out in my series. So I have this one is Queen of the Rockies, set in Montana. And that's book one, came out September 1st. And this one is Song of the Rockies. It's the second book in the Queen of the Rockies series. Just came out October 1st. And the third book in the series, Heart of the Rockies, will be November 1st. And Flower of the Rockies will be December 1st. And then we're into books 5 and 6 in 2022. But I hope you'll check them out. I hope that you will check out Cynthia L. Simmons. And can you share with us where to find you on the internet?
Yes. Well, I use the L in my name because my father did not have a name. He was only initials. He was C period L period. And so he named me Cynthia Lynn so that I would have his initials. So in his memory, I use Cynthia L. Simmons as the name I write with. And my website is clsimmons.com. And if you want to look for me online, if you will put my middle initial L in there, Cynthia L. Simmons, I will pop up everywhere because I'm all over the internet.
Yay, that's awesome. And again, tell us the title of your latest book.
The latest book is Reflecting Gold. It's the third book in the Gold series, the Southern Gold series. It was Valuing Gold, and then it was Pursuing Gold, and then it was Reflecting Gold. And that's the last one.
And folks, we will put links to these in the show notes. And so be sure to tune into our show notes so that you can find these links. And thank you, Cynthia L. Simmons, for being with us today.
And it
And
was a pleasure.
I appreciate that very much. And we will be back with you very soon for our next show.